My name is Rabbi Mordechai Lightstone, and my wife and I run a community called Tech Tribe based in New York, creating events and experiences for Jews in tech and digital media. And through that, it's been a pleasure to be able to have these wonderful chances to explore fascinating topics, I guess, on the intersection of technology and ideas and obviously Judaism and stuff like that, with the Jewglers. And so this talk is called "How Do You Keep Shabbat in Outer Space?" or "Jews in Space." It's actually a cool graphic we designed for this because it's like we've done a series of talks on and kind of art installations on the subject of Judaism in space. So when we speak about how one keeps Shabbat, so obviously we know Shabbat is the seventh day of the week, that God created the world 7 days, rested on the seventh, and therefore it is the 6 days, rest on the seventh. And the seventh day is a chance for the Jewish people to connect in study and prayer, share a meal, all kinds of great things like that. But how do we determine when the seventh day is? And when we figure out how one calculates, the seventh day, then we can begin to understand how it might apply to Jewish experiences outside of the orbit of Earth. So to begin with, it's worth noting that Shabbat itself comes from a personal counting of things, meaning, normally speaking, you're in a community and you celebrate with the rest of the community. However, the Talmud, in the tractate that speaks about Shabbat, presents a particular case, and it goes as follows. Rav Huna said, "One who is walking along the way or in the desert and does not know when Shabbat occurs. He counts 6 days from the day that he realized that he lost track of Shabbat, and then observes one day of Shabbat." So the person is walking, is a caravan, is alone, and he realizes at some point in time, I have no idea what day of the week it is. I don't know if it's Monday or Thursday, or, I think we had a bit of this over the past year with Corona as well, to a certain degree. But, in the event, he has no way of knowing, and he's alone, he can't ask anyone else, and therefore he has no idea when Shabbat is. So we have a disagreement. Rav Huna, the first opinion, says, okay, once you have a point of doubt, that's your Sunday. Begin counting 6 days. And on the seventh day of your doubt, that's when you'll rest, and that is Shabbat for you. Chia Bar Rav says he first observes one day Shabbat, and then he counts 6 weekdays. So Chia Bar Rav says, you realize you know which day Shabbat? That day that you realize, that's your Shabbat. You've now begun, stop, make Kiddush, take a break. You've now, if it's safe to do so, obviously, if it's dangerous to keep walking, but you've now, as soon as a person has a moment of doubt, that begins the Shabbat. You don't count up to it, you kind of count down from it. So the Talmud asks, with regard to what do they disagree? Why does one say start counting, the other says, start right away? One stage of Huna held, it's like the creation of the world. Weekdays followed by Shabbat. So we're going, so to speak, on the timeline. Genesis says starts from day one, so we're studying from day one. And one stage, Chia Barav held, it's like Adam, the first man, was created on the sixth day, and therefore, as soon as you realize, as you're following the kind of the trajectory of human beings, that you start right away with Shabbat. So that is disagreement, and this idea was useful, I guess, for Jews who were in caravans, who were traveling around, and on the trade, on the Silk Road, and things like that. Jews, were merchants, and it was a case that existed. Now, one of the questions that intersects with this case is the question of a prime meridian in kind of Jewish thought, meaning where do we begin to count the day and move on towards the hours around this. And this is something that has been discussed in Jewish texts going back to the Middle Ages. The Kuzari, which is a very famous work, presents one idea saying that Jerusalem is the kind of the prime meridian, is the Greenwich Mean Time of the Jewish world. We begin counting from Jerusalem, and then you go kind of eastward and westward and things like that. But in any event, in discussing this idea about when one person has Shabbat, the Radbaz, who was a famous rabbi in Egypt and other countries during the 15th, 16th century, was asked the following question and gave this answer. And this is going to help us better clarify what it means when you have a person traveling, and they suddenly start keeping Shabbat on their own. What is that day? Is it really Shabbat? Is it not? As we'll see. So he begins with the question he was asked. Says, "You've requested from me that I inform you of my opinion on the matter of the Shabbat. For there's a great difference between the residents of the East and the residents of the West. We find that Shabbat, that is Shabbat for them, and still weekday for the others. It's time zones, and so therefore, when Shabbat begins in Jerusalem, it may not have begun yet any country further to the west. So therefore, how is it possible that you have Shabbat happening in one place and not happening in another place? So you must know that this question has perplexed many and perplexed many respectable people. So it's both a very broad question and one that the greatest minds have weighed in on. But I'll inform you of my opinion on this matter. You must know that Shabbat was given for every Jew, for it said, "For it is a sign between me and you." There's a personal experience going over here, and there's an individual commandment upon each and every one of us to keep Shabbat. So this means what? The Shabbat was given to everyone according to his place in which he lives. For in his place, 6 rotations of the sun have finished, and the seventh begins early in the early places and late in the later places. And so that each person celebrates Shabbat based on where they are on the map. And when you've had 6 days have passed, based on wherever you are in the world, and the seventh day is beginning where you are, at that point in time, Shabbat begins. So, considering, say, New York and London, when sun sets in London, Shabbat begins in London, and it's still weekday, obviously, in New York City until, Shabbat, the sun sets there, Shabbat begins there, and then all the way in Mountain View, you'll have you'll wait another 3 hours or so for Shabbat to actually enter. So we find that this location-based Shabbat, from what the sages say, he who travels in the desert and does not know when Shabbat is, counts 6 days from the day when he lost track, and sanctifies the seventh, and says Kiddush, does Havdalah after the Shabbat. So this is exactly, the case we spoke about beforehand from the Talmud, that someone's lost, and then on the seventh day, according to Rav Huna, which is the main opinion, we begin to keep Shabbat at that very moment. And when you do so, it's Shabbat for you in all manners. You're making Kiddush, you're taking out your bottle of wine that you carried, which is what one does when travels in the desert, and when Shabbat is over, you're taking out a candle and then more wine, making Havdalah, so that person who's traveling makes Shabbat and celebrates Shabbat based on his or her personal calculation of when they've hit the seventh day. And so here he has a caveat, and this is a very interesting caveat, that even though he should be careful the other days to avoid breaking Shabbat, meaning if you look in the way this law, this passage of the Talmud we discussed previously is discussed, in its full halachic, full legalistic implications, they say once a person has lost track of the days, they should really be careful every day not to do any unnecessary work. Meaning, obviously, you have to travel, you're traveling, you have to carry, you got to carry because you're lost in the desert, you have to get out. But, you shouldn't, for example, write down, random notes or do some other form of prohibited malacha, prohibited work on Shabbos, because, any day might be Shabbos. So that would seem to say that maybe it really isn't Shabbos. You might think that maybe that the fact that you've counted 6 days and chose the seventh, that's just an arbitrary thing, so that you have something to do, so that you remember it. So the Radbaz says no. He says that even though that person was instructed only doing what is minimally required to do to live, this is because it is doubtful whether it is Shabbat for all the residents of the province that he is in, and the prohibitions of Shabbat fall upon him. Meaning that the reason why a person has to be careful not to do it is because as the person is walking across the Sahara Desert, let's say, they're crossing multiple time zones, and it could be that where the other people are, that they are keeping Shabbos, or they're keeping their Shabbos based on their calculation. But from the fact that he's obligated to make Kiddush on the seventh day, that is the day given to everyone to commemorate the creation, each one in his current place. The fact that he's making Kiddush on his calculation, meaning even if it happens to be his calculation is wrong, and it's actually he's making Kiddush on a Wednesday afternoon, since based on his calculation and his count of seven, it's now become Shabbos. For him, it is truly Shabbos. It is truly this new day. And then the truth side truly is his own personal Sabbath day. And therefore, we see this idea that theoretically speaking, a person can be keeping, Shabbos based on his count on one day, and everyone else will be keeping on another day. And for each person, they're experiencing their own personal Shabbat that's real. They're making Kiddush, they're following all the laws. It fully is Shabbos, even though they're doing it at different times. How is that possible? What does that mean? How could it be that, both, on the rare occurrence where someone is lost in the desert and suddenly, they start counting on a Wednesday and they start keeping Shabbos on Wednesday, that for them is somehow really Shabbat, number one. And number two, much more common is when you have questions of international dateline, where you have, where, you have it's Shabbos for one person and not for another person. How can that be? Isn't this some sort of, spiritual experience that should envelop the whole world? So for this, we look at the Code of Jewish Laws written by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, where he discusses something very interesting. So the beginning of his statement is that a person should, that midnight is not a time to frivol away. It's actually a time to devote to prayer and Torah study and things like that, which is obviously what I'm sure what all of us are doing at midnight, or at least we try. So he said, and so he says as follows: Midnight is a time of divine favor above, at all times and in all places, even though although the length of the days and nights varies according to the climates, i.e., the various latitudes, and all the longitudinal distances between one country and another, that does not change the above. This is similar to the times for reciting Shema, the times at which the Shabbat or festivals commence, which are also calculated for each country according to the times of its own day and night. So each time when you have this divine revelation, be a time of divine will and goodness above, like midnight, or if it's the time of divine blessings, that come through Shabbat or the festivals. Whenever you're experiencing that time, that's when that divine revelation is happening in your life. And he gives this kind of deeper spiritual explanation for the time of the divine favor above. And the superlative is affected by the recitation of the Shema and the Shemona Esrei, and the sanctity of the Shabbos and the festivals. So all these different time-based commandments that we experience all transcend the limits of time and space. That really all these concepts are beyond time and space. Shabbat is a concept that's beyond, kind of time-space continuum. But as it enters in this world and becomes down, though they radiate downward into the physical realms to each and every place at the time appropriate for it, that creates the vessel for that revelation to take place at that particular time. So an example, and to explain something interesting, we know that generally speaking, Jewish holidays outside of Israel are 2 days, right? Or always speaking outside of Israel, they're 2 days. You have, Rosh Hashanah is 2 days, besides Yom Kippur, which is a fast day, but every other day is kept for two as a 2 day holiday. When biblically, if you look in the Torah, it says only to keep one day. And in Israel, every day besides Rosh Hashanah is kept for one day. The reason this happened is because historically, the calculation of the count of when a new holiday would begin was based on when the new month begins. And as the lines of communication, originally they had a whole fire network where they light fires from from the temple in Jerusalem, and they light fires from hilltop to hilltop. People would sit up and wait and light a fire to let people know when the new month was. And then you would count 2 weeks, and then you would have Sukkot, you would have Sukkot, or you'd have Passover, any other holiday, if and it would come out from Jerusalem that way. But there was a group of people that decided to make some trouble and started lighting the fire on the wrong day, meaning that because of the lunar month is 29 and a half days, and we have full days, you don't have half days, you don't always know when the new month is beginning. So the day before, the day after the new month, they light a fire as well, and it would confuse the ability for people living far away from the capital, in Jerusalem, to be able to know when to keep the holidays. So instead, the Sanhedrin, the High Court, began to send out messengers. They send messengers out to all the kind of the Jews in Greater Israel, and eventually onto the diaspora that existed somewhat then, to let people know when to keep the holidays. The problem was the messengers, now that they're riding on horseback or camelback or whatever it is, can only go so fast. They're not able to get out the word as quickly as the fire is being lit from mountaintop to mountaintop. So at that point in time, people outside of the borders of Israel often would not be able to find out when the new moon had happened and when the new month was beginning, and therefore when to celebrate the holidays on time. And so therefore, since they didn't know if it's a month of 29 or 30 days, if it's a full moon lunar month or a shorter one, they would then keep the new month based on a day of doubt. So they would celebrate 2 days of the holiday. In case it was the 29th or the 30th, so they'd have this double count and have the 2 days of the holiday celebrated. And therefore today, all of this to say, today we also, outside of Israel, we keep the second day as part of this tradition. So one may ask, why is it that you have 2 days outside and one day inside of Israel? Especially now that we have a calendar and we're able to know. And yes, it's a custom and we do it, but what's kind of the deeper explanation of it? So here, Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying there's something going on over here. That since the divine revelations of the holiday are really this transcendent concept. It's really something that goes above and beyond the flow of time. But that when it comes down to this world, it relegates it to that specific time, each place according to what it is on the clock. So the time of divine favor and will that happens at midnight comes down at one time. When it's midnight in New York, when it's midnight in San Francisco, it's a different time. Midnight in Australia, it's a different time. Each place has its own midnight and its own revelation. Then, so too, when the holiness of the holidays comes down into this world in Israel, due to the fact that it's the land of Israel, it's a sacred place, sacred land. There's such intense and fervent holiness there. All that energy can be brought down in one shot. But if you're in diaspora, where things are, a little bit more mundane, and you need that extra jolt, it comes down and expresses itself over the course of 2 days. So all this whole passage is to say, and it's a little bit deep, and it's a bit to wrap your mind around, is to say that when a person celebrates Shabbat based on their calculation, if the person lost in the desert and his calculation begins on Wednesday and he's celebrating Shabbat on Wednesday, obviously doesn't know what day it is. For him, that divine revelation, that sacredness of the Sabbath, comes down into his world, into his physical space based on his count. And so therefore, that gives the ability that really is truly a Sabbath day. It truly is a Shabbos day, a Shabbat day for him or her when that happens. So this has all been predicated on this idea of a person being lost. But how does that get us to being in space? Because you're hopefully not lost in space. So there is a paradigm that exists right here on Earth that kind of through discussions of that example, we were able to begin to understand how to celebrate Shabbat in outer space. So that was for people who are traveling to the Arctic. Why? Because the Arctic, as we're going to get into during the summer and the winter by the poles, has an incredibly long period of time in which the sunlight. I mean, even in slightly lower countries where there is regular, where there are actually established Jewish communities. I spent some time in St. Petersburg, in Russia, so you have the White Knights over there. My friend is the Chabad rabbi in Iceland. If you ever go to Iceland, you could send him my regards. So he tweeted that when for him Shabbat, because it was the White Knights this past week, the last kind of week of June, so you had the longest days of the summer. So he wasn't able to technically make Havdalah until Monday evening for him because of the way when the actual sunset came about and things like that. But the point is that when somebody hits the poles, how do you calculate time? So we have two different opinions, as Jews are wont to have, about how we determine when the Shabbat is. So the first one is from a Sefer Mor Oktzia, which is written by Rabbi Yaakov Emden. He was a rabbi in Altona, Germany, and he wrote an incredible amount of works, very fascinating works. We've actually quoted him before when we spoke about Can Robots Be Jewish, because he wrote about a golem. That he had a family tradition that his great-great-grandfather had made a golem. So he writes about all these interesting topics, and he says as follows. One wonders, what should those people living near the poles do? Due to their extreme proximity to the poles, the daylight can stretch on for a month or two until one reaches the most extreme points on the globe, where the daylight can last for 6 months, and so too the night can go on for 6 months. At such a place, where there's neither sunrise nor sunset, how should they keep Shabbat? This is his question. It's our question, right? So he says that in a place where you don't have the movement of the sun to be able to determine when sunrise and sunset are, so he posits the following answer. It seems to me they should count 7 days. Maybe 24 hours is counted on our clocks, right? So you hit, the North Pole, you now no longer have any sense of when day and hour are. So you're now going to start, that becomes your Sunday, the day you arrive at the pole, based on 24 hours on your clock. The count should begin from when the person arrives, counting the days based on the passage of hours, and thus celebrating Shabbat on the seventh day of this personal count. He doesn't say it explicitly, but this seems to be similar to the idea of being lost in the desert, that as soon as you're lost in the desert and you realize you no longer have count, that becomes Sunday, and you count on. And so he says when you hit the North Pole or the South Pole, and by application, according to his opinion, when you go to outer space, you no longer have the passage of time. That becomes day one for you, and you just count 7 days on from there. And that would be the answer according to Rav Yaakov Emden. But as some people point out. The problem is you can't use the case of being lost in the desert and apply it to here. Why? When you're lost in the desert, that's out of your control. You just suddenly don't realize you don't know what the count of days are. But if a person chooses to go to the North Pole, they may still have a calendar. They may still know what's going on time-wise. They still may be able to follow. They're unable to actually begin to keep Shabbos because you need the sunrise and sunset, theoretically at least, before we get into it, to activate that time. And that's the question. You can't say it's a direct example of the person who's lost in the desert because lost in the desert, you're lost. In this case, the person is not lost. So a second answer comes from Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz. He wrote a book called Tiferes Yisrael, which is a commentary on the Mishnah. He kind of has two commentaries. One is very direct and kind of just makes each piece of the Mishnah as part of the Talmud, kind of clear and explains it. And the second thing, he goes off on all kinds of fascinating tangents. And so this is one of the tangents that he goes out on. And it was actually interesting because he was a rabbi in Danzig, it's Gdansk, Poland. And I've actually been to Gdansk, and I can tell you that they do have something similar to the White Nights, where it's there's no real sunrise and sunset for a couple of days this time of year, and therefore he kind of writes about what they should do locally in his area, and then by extension, he gets into this question. So he says, one must wonder what a person who finds himself by the North Pole during the summer, where the days last 6 months, should do. And that's how should the Jews who go there on boats, on whaling expeditions, conduct themselves. This was a real case. I guess at least theoretically, you had Jewish whalers who were out there, hunting whales. And while they were out there, they, they would hit the poles. And then now they no longer have sunrise and sunset. It's lasting 6 months. How should they calculate the time? So he says, perhaps the sailors could follow the sun as it spins around the sky in horizontal circles every 24 hours. That, apparently, when you're by the poles, the sun still has some sort of movement as it moves from one side of the sky to the other and back and forth. It never truly sets and dips below the horizon. And therefore, if you're going to start being able to follow the movement of the sun, you can say every time you have the movement from one side to the other, that's a day. And therefore, once you've had that full movement, then you can begin counting based on that movement, to know when a new day is, and then go on from there. So that and that's we arrive in North Pole on Sunday. You get there on Sunday. So then when you see it move to one side, okay, now you've had a full day. Now it's Monday, and you count such rotations and know which day is Shabbat. Maybe that's the answer. But there's a problem with this answer, he says. Why? Yet surely that would not help him know which hours to pray during the day, nor to know when exactly Shabbat enters and ends. So what should you do? You're seeing the movement of the sun, so there's been a new day. But how do I know when it's the morning? How do I know when it's the evening? There's different commandments to do. It's to say Shema in the morning, Shema in the evening. You don't know exactly when which time of the day it is. So therefore, how are you going to follow what's going on? So he says, should he perhaps follow the clocks of those in Europe or those in America or some other country? Rather, and this is his answer, and this is the answer that we're going to be kind of using moving forward. When he reaches the North Pole, he should look to the clock from where he set sail. So he has a clock. He sees he left from Danzig, from the port of Gdansk in Poland, and now he has that time. And so let's say he reaches the pole at 6 p.m. on that clock. 6 p.m. in this case would be a theoretical on an evenly split day would be sunset. He should begin counting 24 hours until the next day. And on the seventh day, it is a Shabbat. So he begins to count using the time from where they came originally, from where he departed. And thus, and there's an interesting application of this, if a group of Europeans and a group of Americans meet at the North Pole, right? So if we have someone coming from New York and someone coming from London and they meet at the North Pole, but guess what? They've now come from different time zones. Each one would keep Shabbat based on the times they left their point of origin. And therefore, you'd have two groups stationed, theoretically, if you're a scientist, a bunch of Jewish scientists, in the South Pole, let's say, and you have 6 months of sunlight, and you have a group from America and a group from England. At the poles, they would theoretically be keeping Shabbat on different days, each group according to when they left their point of origin, following the time of their point of origin. All right, so now we're going to get into the final answer. And this was actually an answer that was applied in real life. I have a friend. His father is the Chabad rabbi in what's called the Space Coast around Cape Canaveral. And when Ilan Ramon, the Israeli astronaut, wanted to fly was slated to fly with NASA on a mission, So even though Ilan Ramon himself did not keep Shabbat as a normal code of conduct, he felt the responsibility that here he is, he's traveling, he's representing the Jewish people. He wants to be able to. He's not the first Jew in space by any means, but he felt he felt a sense that he should actually you know try and keep as much as he could as representative of these greater concepts of the Jewish people, and therefore he turned to Rabbi Konakov, the rabbi in Florida, who then wrote to a number of other rabbis asking them, what exactly should they do? He had his own ideas, and he wanted to check to make sure that he was following the right idea. And so this was the actual response given to Ilan Ramon, or to Rabbi Kanakov to give to Ilan Ramon about how he should conduct himself. I mean, practically speaking, for Ilan Ramon, both because many of the duties performed on the spaceship are considered life-saving and essential. His keeping of Shabbat was not the way it would have been, if he were back home. And as well, obviously, it was an ill-fated trip that when they went to land, you had the horrible disaster which destroyed the shuttle Columbia. But this was an actual question, and there's always something unique when you have a question that's not just some sort of theoretical discussion. When it comes to what's called halacha lamaisa, when it comes to actually applying it to real life, it gives a real pertinence to the answer. And so this is the answer. So our fulfillment, this is from someone named Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Halpern. He had an institute, passed away a couple of years ago, an institute for the discussion of science and Jewish law. And his answer was as follows. Our fulfillment of the commandments depends upon the passage of time. Like the sages say, God called the light and commanded to perform in the midst of the day. And God called the darkness and commanded to perform in the midst of the night. So we have commandments that are for the daytime, like putting on tefillin. You have commandments for the nighttime, like Shabbat candles. You have commandments for the nighttime, to say Shema at night, for example. And you have some commandments which are timeless, to give charity, for example, overall, except when giving charity be prohibited on Shabbat. You have different commandments fall into different parts of the day, and each one is clearly connected to that time of day. It is clear that all this applies to someone that lives in a time when the day and night combine to 24 hours, as opposed to someone who every 90 minutes experiences a new day, because that's what happens for an astronaut in outer space, and this is actually talking about practical application. And that's over the course of 24 hours would need to put on tefillin some 16 times, because if you're going around the earth every 90 minutes, every 90 minutes is a new day. Over the course of a day, you're going to have to put on tefillin each time. Say the daily morning and evening Shema is 32 times, because you say Shema twice a day, so you're doing it then as well. And celebrate Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and all the other holidays every 20 days. So therefore, if we're going to say that a person literally has to, every time they go around the earth and experience that orbit around the earth, that's a new day for them, which that is the principal problem. So we can get to briefly when it comes to, being on Mars, for example, whatever. But as practically speaking, for an astronaut in outer space, you can't go based on how many times you go around the Earth, or Earth goes around you, or whatever's going on over there when you're out of space. So therefore, we have to have a different thing. It would truly become impossible to keep such a count, right? You start counting number of seconds that Shabbat lasts, and things like that. Rather, it makes sense that we follow the case of someone lost in the desert, does lost track of when Shabbat is. Then, in order that Shabbat not be lost in space, the person begins to count from the time he took off. Right. So we're saying that you're again following this idea that you're going to count 6 days, and make the seventh holy. But we're following the concept put out about going to the North Pole that Tiferes Yisrael, kind of the second one we spoke about, gives. That what? That in order for the Shabbat not to be lost in space, the person should begin counting from when he took off. So if he left the Earth at sunset, he'd wait 12 hours and begin the day. And thus following the clock of where he left off, Cape Canaveral, for example, the cycle does continue, counting days according to the time of the place he left, celebrating Shabbat when they do. And stick to the holidays and other commandments, he would follow the time from where he took off. So if today, if most, I think a lot of the launches until now have been in, from Kazakhstan, for example, on Russian vessels, or whatever it is, a person follows the time from where they take off, and that's when they keep Shabbat based on what they do, that they're following the time from where they come. This would also apply theoretically to a Martian colony. Why? Because if you have a research station on Mars, and we're sending humans to Mars, for example, so the Martian day itself is like 25 and some odd hours. It's not 24 hours, and therefore you can't follow the movement of the sun in the sky from Mars, because you're going to become and suddenly have a very different track of time. Rather, what should you do? the person traveling would follow the time from where they left. Part of this is based on actually spoke to Rabbi Kanakov about this, so I was curious myself, based on his research, that currently NASA, for example, has the federal government has no plans to send people up to Mars to settle and live on Mars forever. Rather, the plans are that anyone going there would have to come back, and since you have to come back, you're always on a trip. Since you're always on a trip, you're going to follow this idea of that when a person is left, they are going to keep the count from where they left. And so this is the practical answer that that basically when a person wants to keep Shabbat in outer space and do anything connected to Jewish time in outer space is based on the time of where they took off from. Now, finally, since I always like to conclude these on a not just hopefully a fascinating note of Jewish law, but to have some sort of spiritual lesson. There's a spiritual lesson we can learn from space travel as well. And this is something that happened. It was a conversation between the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Professor Velvel Green. Professor Velvel Green was a professor of xenobiology for NASA, and later on, he worked for various companies that were contracted out by NASA, and he would try and study the existence of microbial life in the cosmos, on other planets. So in this conversation, the Rebbe gave to him a particular case of study of a question and to see how it applies. So he says, in the early days of the space race, scientists faced a quandary. To send a person to the moon, they would need to launch a ship with a considerable amount of fuel. But the increased fuel would need a larger larger part of the ship to be dedicated to storing it, which would add weight to the ship, which would require even more fuel, which in turn would need even more place for storage. This is one of the principal challenges of going out to outer space. You need a lot of fuel to be able to leave, to slip the Stirling bonds, to be able to leave Earth and touch, outer space, and therefore you need a lot of fuel. But the more fuel you need a bigger ship to store it. The bigger ship you need, the less fuel you have, the more fuel you're going to need to be able to lift off that to pick up that larger ship. So how is it possible for such a large spacecraft that stores all the necessary fuel to be able to leave and not become too heavy? So the answer that scientists turned to was the idea of a multi-staged rocket. By jettisoning stages, when they run out of the propellant, the mass of the remaining rocket is decreased. Each successive stage can also be optimized for specific operating conditions. This staging allows the thrust of the remaining stages to more easily accelerate the rocket to its final speed and height. And so therefore, as you've seen, and you're very familiar, as the rocket takes off, especially if you look at the mission to the moon with Apollo missions, you have this huge thing, and ultimately ends up in outer space. It's just the teeny tip of the rocket itself, and that each stage has an amount of fuel, and once it becomes quite literally dead weight, it's jettisoned and dropped down, and the ship continues to go up. So this is an actual real life case. What's the lesson for us? There's a lesson we can learn. Small children are often motivated by simple prizes, stickers and candy, things like that. As they grow older, the source of the motivation changes. So a child may go from giving them a lollipop to maybe earning a toy. Then, getting good grades becomes a source of motivation, success in school. I want to graduate. I want to go to a good college. I want to go to grad school. I want to get a job at a great company. And ultimately, as adults, we can appreciate the reward of the deed itself. And when we're adults, we truly have a robust, appreciation of the things we do. That we can experience the complex sense of satisfaction through achieving and accomplishing something done with transformative intent. You did something. You accomplished something. The job well done can become a motivating, factor for a person that has and can appreciate that. Each sense of reward is a stage in the trajectory of our launch. As we grow, as we reach new heights, we jettison the old motivation and favor the loftier ones. Try to motivate an adult with a lollipop. You tell a kid, here, take this lollipop over here. The kid loves to do the task for a lollipop. You ask an adult to do something for a lollipop, odds are they're not going to want it. And either it will fail because the adult's going to say, I don't want your lollipop, or there's going to be something else wrong because, an adult who's motivated by getting a lollipop has serious problems or definitely has something going on over there. So too in terms of our Jewish identities. The early sense of motivation and education we experience as Jews is ideal for those early stages of development. But as we grow, our relationship and appreciation for what we strive to do must grow as well. Basing our Jewish identity on what we learned in Hebrew school, our preparation for bar mitzvah, is to rely on our earlier stage. Just like you can't motivate a child. You can motivate a child with one thing, but you can't, an adult motivated by childish reasons and childish goals, is missing something critical. So to us Jews, if we're basing our Jewish identities on those forms of motivation or those things that we knew from our youth, then we've somehow stunted our own kind of Jewish identities. And then instead, what we have to do is we have to move and probe new depths in our own Jewish selves and explore those things. And we already, and that way we can move even higher and already on our way to obtain new heights. And so that is the conclusion of this. That next time you're in outer space, make sure to keep count based on wherever you took off from, and then as well, to always grow as we blast off, I guess, in life. So now we have some time for questions and answers. I mean, I think when a person is kind of traveling in a kind of floating space station, so there you don't have any cycle other than you're going to have to create an arbitrary cycle, right? So, and I imagine that practically speaking, whatever the artificial cycle is, at least for, I mean, we're talking, some distant future where, people, generations in space, I don't know, they may move to some other things. I think they say like physically speaking, people actually operate on like a 25-hour clock or something. There's like some sort of biological clock that's a little bit different. So that I'm not sure about. But when we're talking about, as long as they are in contact with Earth, and one would imagine as Jews, maybe being in contact with Earth is important no matter what, because of our connections to here and to the greater Jewish community, whatever. As long as Earth is part of that picture, so then you're probably going to be relying on some sort of Earth calendar, and that Earth calendar will probably be from the main place one leaves, or something like that. It becomes a real question, at that point in time when people are living on some other planet that has a 40-hour day, and they have zero plans to ever come back to Earth ever, and they're just there forever. That's not quite as clear. There are some opinions that maybe then you would switch to Jerusalem time, because in the absence of all other times and all other connections to anything else, then you just move on to that, and then you're going to be having a 40-hour day with like Shabbat every day and a half or whatever it is, and every that weird calculation every week and a half or half a week.
Yep.
So that remains to be seen. I guess we have to get there first. But definitely, even in the not so near future, when you have people on a Martian, station, which is a ways off, currently, but at least it's something that's being discussed. Since the federal government plans to consistently, have people come back, they don't want to commit anyone to this type of, life sentence. As long as that's the operating case, then you would just continue to follow the time anyways from where you left from. Right. I mean, but it would be strange either way. And I think eventually, you have people way out there forever, then it's just going to be. I mean, but the reality is, as Jews, we kind of have our own time anyway, right? Meaning that, the Jewish day starts in the evening as opposed to, the secular calendar, which is at midnight. And we have our own years, and the years change in the middle of the year and our own calculation of months. So we kind of, you maybe would just have this Jewish time, which is maybe even more abstract from whatever the local, Alpha Centauri time is that you're running on. But this is just the Jewish time that people keep. And then, suddenly, yeah, I know it's in the middle of our 40-hour day, but it's now, become a new night for me or something. Might be. So it's one of those interesting things to see how we get there, I guess. I enjoyed this a lot, and let's be in touch and see about, doing some more in the future if people are interested or whatever it is.